Good afternoon, and welcome to the session of the Keynote of Africana Conference. My name is Drusilla Houston. I'm the coordinator of Africana Studies. We started, the conference proper early this morning, and of course we have other sessions afterwards. But it's a wonderful moment, for us, long awaited, to listen to our keynote speaker. At this point, I'd like, to thank everyone who has stepped out, and our colleagues, members of the university community, the leadership. I can't, begin to take on the names of everyone one by one, because at times we need to seize the day. So I'll bring my colleague up here, Dr. Joan Gavin, to formally introduce the speaker, and then we can get things rolling. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, it's so nice to see all of you here, all the members of the Africana Studies Committee, Dr. Benson, our provost, all the faculty. It's wonderful to see my friend Merle Winger, who is part of the Furious Flower Advisory Board. And I'm looking around, and also all of the faculty members and heads of departments. I won't start naming everybody. But it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to introduce you to my friend. But before I forget, I want to make sure that all those people, all the students here, for a passport, Karen Rishma will be right back here in the corner when the program is over, and we're going to try to make sure that the program is over by 1 o'clock. So you can meet your, by 2 o'clock, so you can meet your next appointment. Yeah, okay, all right. So this is great. I see Valerie Gant in the audience. I want to thank her for everything she has done for Furious Flower this past semester and this semester to help us. In fact, because of the Center for Multicultural Student Services, we are able to utilize the Passport program to get students out. And all of our students who leave our programs say, oh, I'm so glad I came to that program. I learned so much. So I want to introduce you to a fellow Baltimorean. It's always wonderful to bring friends to campus, but this was kind of interesting. I am on the Africana Studies Committee, and we were sitting around talking about people who had wonderful stories to tell. And I thought about Dr. Peggy Brooks Bertram. And as it turns out, she became the keynote for this particular conference, and we're extremely happy about that. But Peggy Brooks Bertram went to Goucher College in Baltimore, and then later on went to the Johns Hopkins University, I should say, School of Hygiene and Public Health. And she got her doctorate there as well as her master's. She is now a teacher at the University of Buffalo. She's also taught at Buffalo State College. She is the co-founder and president of Uncrowned Queens Institute for Research and Education on Women. And she heads up the group that's now called Uncrowned Community Builders. She has several books, and you can see those in your, probably your bios. But just in case, for you students who don't have those in front of you, Dr. Bertram is also an author and has published individually and collectively several books, including 4 volumes of Uncrowned Queens, African American Women, Community Builders of Western New York, and Uncrowned Queens, African American Women, Community Builders of Oklahoma. She is also the editor, co-editor, I should say, of Go Tell Michelle. And this is where I enter the picture. It's so interesting how we say something about 6 degrees of separation. Well, in this case, there may just be 3 degrees of separation between me and Dr. Bertram. Let me tell you how that happened. Back in 2008, I saw on the internet a request to submit a piece on Michelle Obama. And interestingly enough, I had a little piece that I tucked away that I never thought I would publish. It was my reaction to going to the National Democratic Convention to see Barack Obama installed as the candidate for president. And my husband, my daughter, and I went there because we thought that this would be a historic occasion. And even if he didn't win, and there was a possibility that he wouldn't have won, but we went there anyway. And my husband did something I thought was wonderful as he was giving his speech. He stood up. We didn't get in. We were in a Mexican restaurant about 2 blocks from the convention. We went all the way to Denver, didn't have a ticket, but we wanted to be there in that space. He stood up and he read litany form the names of all of those people who died before they could see this day happen. And it brought tears to my eyes, and my daughter and I were just weeping. And he was reading this list, not to anybody. He just stood up at our table and read the list. And so I wanted to make note of that occasion. And so I wrote this piece, and I tucked it away. Then when I saw this request for stories on Michelle Obama, I took it out, added a little bit to it, fixed it up, and then sent it to Dr. Brooks Bertram and her partner, Dr. Barbara Nevergold. Is that right? Nevergold. And interestingly enough, about 2 or 3 months later, I got this lovely note from her saying that she really enjoyed the piece. It was one of the best pieces in the collection. So when somebody says that about my writing, I call them up and say, thank you, you know? Well, I called her, and we had this lovely conversation. And the conversation went, well, where were you born? She said, Baltimore. I said, really? I'm from Baltimore. I said, well, where did you live? I thought being, a doctorate and, and all of that she must have come from the west side of Baltimore, where the rich kids lived. She said, East Baltimore. I said, East Baltimore? I grew up in East Baltimore. I said, what street? She said, Barney Street. I said, my goodness, my aunt, my favorite aunt, lived on Barney Street. And I said, my favorite aunt is Aunt May. And she said, you mean Mary James? I said, yeah, that's my aunt. She said, that was my mother's best friend. And she said, I talk to Aunt May, Aunt Mary, as she calls her, every week. Now, I'm her favorite niece, but I don't talk to her every week. I could not believe it. And as it turned out, after the book was out, and after they were going around the country doing a theatrical presentation on the book, I got to meet Dr. Peggy Brooks Bertram. And I brought my aunt with me and some of the other family members, and we had a wonderful reunion. So, you got the rest of the story. You had the first part of the story, the credentials. But you know that it is my honor to introduce my friend, also went to my high school, Dr. Peggy Brooks Bertram. Let's give her a JMU welcome.
All I can say is that I'm absolutely delighted to be here at James Madison University. And I'm so happy that Joanne and I found one another again, because her Aunt May always talked about her and saying, you need to see Joanne. And when she talked to Joanne, she says, you need to see Peggy. And it was back and forth. And I loved her aunt. And as I said, she had been my mother's best friend. And this is about the third time in my life I have been the best friend to a friend that was the best friend of my mother. And that, I think that's rather extraordinary. So let me start. This is a very important thing I want to try to do here today, so bear with me. So I'm extremely happy to present at the annual Africana conference here at JMU. And I offer this presentation as an eternal libation to one of our most worthy ancestors, more than a half century after her death. And I also offer this as a libation to Aunt May, who we will recognize later when I get home on the Uncrowned Queen's website, because she was an extraordinary woman. Without degrees and a lot of fanfare, she was the person that really changed communities, and the one she lived in, all for the better. And she was just an enormously comical woman, funny, in your face, daredevil, you know, would attempt what somebody else wouldn't do, and always knew that she loved her community. So I want to tell you that the person that I'm also offering this as an eternal libation for is Drusilla Houston, the woman that I wrote about and that I continue to write about. And Drusilla Houston was a foremother of Africana historical writing and research. But I also, and in doing her research, she sought to burst asunder the vestiges of notions of the Dark Continent in both academia and among the lay population. Her books, volumes 1 to 6 even, created a bridge between the adherents of the Garvey movement and among the lay populace, but in the Garvey movement and the Harlem Renaissance. Her writing coincided with the Negro Society for Historical Research, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the global researches of Arthur A. Schomburg, Joel A. Rogers, and William A. Huggins. The late Asa G. Hilliard III, in a commentary on my locating and publication of Houston's previously lost Volume 2 of Wonderful Ethiopians, describes Houston thusly. Quote, when the roll is called of the great Africans who corrected the errors and defamation in the ancient story of African people, the list will include Arthur A. Schomburg, John G. Jackson, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan, Theophilo Blanco, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, others, many others. However, with this and other masterworks, that roll of masters must never be called without the name of one whose love for her people and whose model of excellence we now know even better than before, Drusilla Houston. The theme of this conference, the 7th Annual Africana Conference, is religion, ruptures, race, and global peace. In its call for papers, the conference asks for a discussion of various themes and ideas, one of which is about silent and silenced entities, those who speak and are not heard, and those whose voices are literally muted, and how these narratives of silence shape not only classroom but boardroom behavior. I have chosen to cast the theme of my paper around silence and silenced entities. I'll try to build on this area of silent and silenced entities with emphasis on the silenced, to share the search for one particular woman who was not silent, yet was silenced, who spoke but was not heard. This takes me definitely to the life of this extraordinary woman, Drusilla Houston, who was a late 19th and early 20th century African-American woman whose words were loud and strong, but were almost silenced to a whisper. I want to talk of the impact of such women as Houston and to present strategies necessary to raise her voice and the missing of other voices, from a whisper to a major dialogue on lost narratives of African American women, no matter where they are. To do that, my goal is to lift Drusilla from the margins of the historical page and locate her at the center of the narrative page through a conversation with you about who Drusilla Dungey Houston is and what she did. To make the transition from the margin to the center, I want to share a few ideas about the quote-unquote loss of the histories of African American women. Also, to identify some of the sources of this loss. And finally, to suggest ways in which you can contribute to removing the historical invisibility of these women, no matter where they lived in this country. So let me begin with this title for the presentation again. The Marrow is in the Bones, Unearthing African American Women's History, Drusilla Dungey Houston. And let me first define the term marrow, how I am using it, and emphasizing what it means to the human body, its significance for human well-being, and how it symbolizes the importance of African American women's stories to our very personhood and cultural well-being. The human marrow is essential to the human body and is the essence of life. It is found deep in the bones, and its major tasks is in production of the red blood platelets, the stem cells, and other vital essences for life. I use the term bones not only as it holds the marrow, but it also denotes the idea of digging. I want to marry the idea of digging into the history of African American women with discovery of the marrow, or the essence in the bones. Perhaps I should best describe this presentation as a beginning exhumation, as in forensically examining the whys and wherefores of what happened to these bones. That is, the history of African American / Africana women. It is only through major digging and researching that we unearth the histories of these women. I will talk about my efforts at digging for Drusilla. There are many reasons as to why we have to dig so deep and so carefully to retrieve the bones to reveal a more complete history of African American women. And yes, we have made some strides, and this is evident in the number of new encyclopedias from the 1990s and the 2000s on African American women, especially Darlene Clark Hines' work, where I have a paper on Drusilla Dungey Houston. And there's also my own website, which is now 15 years old, called Uncrowned Community Builders, that myself and a colleague produced 15 years ago with the goal of creating a digital collection of biographies that preserve African American women's stories through the efforts of community historians, many of whom are women. Despite these efforts to uncover African American women's history, the journey to and through the marrow of this history is a deep voyage, the contents of which is obscured by other entities that continue to relegate the history of African American women to the margins of the page, namely through misunderstood, incomplete, and marginal work. Silenced entities, and muted voices, those who speak and are not heard, and those whose voices are literally muted, are victims of historical invisibility. Take the case of early Black pioneer women of Oklahoma. Only in the 1990s was there a change of course in Oklahoma African American women's history. And this came with the publication of Linda Reese's 1994 article, Working in the Vineyard, African American Women in All Black Communities. Reese argued that African American women worked through Black social and community organizations to foster a new and positive image of Black womanhood. Later, Reese's original findings were applied to Oklahoma African American women in her 1997 book, Women of Oklahoma, 1980 to 1920. In this analysis, Reese's evidence strongly implied the existence of a unique Oklahoma African American women's culture. 5 years later, in a second doctorate, I explored how the literary and journalistic life of Drusilla Dungey Houston connected with the intellectual lives of contemporaneous African Americans. Most significantly, My study revealed that Oklahoma African American women's racial uplift culture played a significant role in the 1926 publication of Dungey Houston's first book by showing that a link existed between Dungey Houston, national African American male leadership, and elite Oklahoma African American women's culture. This was an extraordinary discovery for me. And these two books, those by Linda Reese and myself, if you read them together, the scholarship of us together indicated a new direction for the analysis of Oklahoma's 52 all of the black towns, but namely the African American women's history. And later, Professor John Ray conducted an analysis of Oklahoma's 2 all-black towns and 6 large African American communities, revealing that they were culturally, socially, economically, and politically dominated by an elite cadre of middle-class African American racial uplift proponents. From the beginning of post-Reconstruction African American migration to Oklahoma in the late 1880s, patterns of settlement and socialization were formulated by the elite African American advocates of racial uplift. And I owe that quote to a friend of mine, a historian, John Ray, who was a wonderful friend of mine and taught me so many things about how to take a look at this history. The Dungey family in particular influenced Oklahoma community life for almost 8 decades, and Drusilla had a key role. Henry David Thoreau, the author of Walden, or Life in the Woods, understood the meaning of marrow. He said he wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. Similar to Thoreau, but dissimilar, Houston thought of her life in another way. Houston thought it was necessary to unearth the dry bones of history and cut to the marrow to exhume not just the history of African people, but to connect this marrow to the origins of history, culture, and civilization straight out of Africa. On completion of her first book, Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empires, she cried out, quote, "And there is more. I need another 25 more years," end of quote. 25 more years of what she called molding and mining to discover the truth of African people and their contributions to world civilization. Her work described Africans leaving their footprints all around the world was far broader than any other work being done at that time, but she was forgotten. It seems like I've been searching for the life of Houston forever. The life story of this free-thinking black Virginia-born, she was born right here in the Shenandoah Valley, born race and class-conscious, working-class intellectual activist is a story that begs to be told. It offers a missing vision and voice that fills major gaps in the historical record of African American women in the American West. And it enables us to significantly reshape our understanding and interpretation of the first decades of the 20th century. Most importantly, perhaps, her story offers profound insights for thinking about race and class, religion, war, democracy, and social change in America by an African American woman in the early 20th century. Now, with that backdrop, let me tell you about Drusilla Houston and what students can do to retrieve the lost histories of African American women. I'm dealing with my allergies. There are 4 things I would like to do, and I'd like to do them rather extemporaneously. And that is, when you talk about this invisibility of people, no matter what kind of contributions they made, and yet they're silenced, you know, intentionally or unintentionally, but we don't know about them. But there are 4 areas I would like to point out is that these people get lost because of the work of historians. And in particular, the historians in here will be familiar with Frederick Jackson Turner's work, yes? And one of the most important things about his work was what he did in so-called documenting the rise of the American West. The major thing that he did aside from talking about the American West, he excluded women. He talked about it as though no one existed except men, namely white men. And in excluding women in an area like Oklahoma, it meant that half of the population would be silenced. And this was the population during that time that was saving the community, raising the community up one stone at a time. And in doing that, other historians who followed him repeated his methodology, so that what was once lost was now buried even deeper. And it was only until recently that people began to take a look at what was happening in the West. It wasn't just a place for cowboys. It wasn't just a place for Annie Oakley. It wasn't just a place for people depicted in the Grapes of Wrath. There were black people who ran out of the South for free land in Oklahoma in the 1880s during the first, second, and third land runs. It was about African Americans who saw a way to get away from a continuing slavery of not being able to go to schools, not being able to vote, all sorts of black codes put into place to block their activities. And this historical oversight came about too because of the way in which the geography of Oklahoma was described. Oklahoma was a Midwestern state, but because so many people, blacks, came from Oklahoma, from the South and went to Oklahoma, the Southern Democrats who controlled the legislators of Mississippi, Alabama, and all these other states, they decided to deal with Oklahoma as though it was a Southern state. And there you have part of the major loss of the history of African Americans because the Southern historians were not going to be involved in that. In addition to that, how these people get lost, for Drusilla Houston, it was a matter of intra-racial strife. This wasn't just white historians who created this. We need to take a look at Drusilla across the whole spectrum of what was happening during the 1920s, during the period of the Harlem Renaissance. And it was in that period that I stumbled across this, trying to understand what was I seeing, that it was the talented 10th that was fighting against the racial uplift community of the black matriarchs in Oklahoma and in the Midwest, saying to them, we don't need you to write anything. If you're going to write anything, write a poem. So they were directing how you could write, how you could think. Don't get involved in these vast cultural conversations or intellectual conversations. And above all, don't write anything unless we dictate what it is. And Drusilla Houston got caught in that void. And I'd like to explain a little bit what the fight was between she and Du Bois, and actually Booker T. Washington. It was an enormous fight because it was a fight of cosmologies. On the one hand, you have Booker T. Washington who's saying, you know, black people, don't worry about it. Don't aspire to these higher things. You know, learn to work with your hands and you'll be just fine. On the other hand, and we call that this kind of assimilationist theory. And on the other hand, we had Du Bois who was saying, no, we're looking for full integration. That's what the cosmology is here with reference to me. And this is what the men of the Harlem Renaissance were going for at the time. And Drusilla Houston interjected herself into that intellectual discussion in a powerful way. She said, no, I have the answer. The answer is that we want voluntary segregation. We want to go into these black towns, continue them as black towns, keep them as black towns. We will remind ourselves of our culture and our history. We will go back to the farms, which we know the most about. We will farm the land. We'll build up the animals and the stock and what have you. And we will sell. We're going to get the world to beat a path to our door. This is all black towns, at least 100 of them at one time. That was her cosmology. Flew in the face of anything that was happening during the Harlem Renaissance. She had to be silenced. And the way to silence her was to ignore her. To ignore her or to misrepresent her. And the dialogue, the first letter, December 26, 1926, she writes to Du Bois and says to him, I have 6 volumes here. I have gone down into African history. And I know that if the white man sees these volumes and reads these volumes, he will know who he is, because you know the only people on the planet who don't know where they came from are African or white people. They don't know where they come from. They don't know their history. They don't know that it's intimately intertwined with our history. And that's what I have discovered, is what she said. Du Bois would have none of that. She says, I have included here a copy of the book that I just published. I would like you to review it in the Crisis magazine. I'd like to be considered as a part of all the other writers that you have. He writes back in a very short note and says, I have glanced through your book. You have a lot of research here, but you need to go to school so that you will understand how to write. Maybe take some correspondence courses. Drusilla snaps back in January. Dear Miss Esteemed Dr. Du Bois, my father had a library of 3,000 books, and in those 3,000 books, I've read every one of them. I have ownership of many journals that I write for, that I pay for every month. And I have spent 25 years tracing the trail of African people from the dawn of civilization all the way around the Mediterranean Levant, all the way up and down the Don River in the Caucasus Mountains. I've traced them up and down the Himalayas. I've traced them to China. I've traced them across the Persian Gulf into South Arabia and across the Indian Ocean. I know about black people. And I would like you to give me a review. But if you decide not to, I'll be sorry about that, but you should do this. He didn't answer her anymore. Alan Locke writing, again during the Harlem Renaissance, all having an effort, making an effort at indicating that it was the black man who was going to rescue the black population from the problems it was having with the white population, and that the black women would have to take a lead from this. That under no circumstances would they come forward, be brought forward. Drusilla Houston was in a very unique position by 1926. In fact, she began in that position about 1914. Her brother bought a newspaper called the Oklahoma Black Dispatch. And Drusilla Houston had access to a newspaper. She taught herself how to lay type, and every week for 30 years, she wrote an editorial in the newspaper. I was fortunate to have been able to find 4,000 of them and to be able to read them and walk backwards through her life. And in doing that, I saw a woman who challenged Du Bois, the leading man in African-American historiography and history and activities at the time, take him on full throttle. It would cost her dearly. But this was a woman who would call out to him, you know, you're a man, you have no religion, you have no God. You know, ordinary black people won't follow you. They have to follow someone who has a God. And she was speaking also to the notion that he was viewed himself as a socialist or as a communist. She took him on at Fisk University when there was a protest that he had organized with students. And she wrote it up in the paper and said, Du Bois has done his part for us. You know, he's smart, he's intellectual, and we should follow that lead. But he is not a God-fearing man, and God tells us we can't follow him. And the fight was on. Everywhere she stepped to try to get some movement on her work, she was blocked. And she was especially horrified when her brother, who was a good friend of Du Bois, joined with Du Bois to create a kind of a scheme which would deny her recognition of being an African-American woman who was interested and had actually gotten involved intimately in the education of the black student. Because in 1917, she started the Sepulpa Training School for black girls, starting it from scratch with the sanction of the black leadership in the black church in Oklahoma. And she'd done all kinds of things. And in education, she had written books, she had written bulletins, and she had decided to write curriculum. And even earlier in 1902, she developed a school called the McAllister Seminary for Boys and Girls. And she bought a printing press there and taught the boys how to lay print so that they could become newspapermen as well. So Drusilla was never, ever idle. And she had all of these skills. Her newspapers, columns were being read all around the country, and they were being read all throughout the West Indies. And so she knew that people were hearing her. And the trauma is, and this takes me into the third problem, and that is the loss of papers. Any of you who have grandmothers and great-grandmothers who have piles of papers that you don't understand, take some time and go through them. Take time. You'll be surprised what you find. And it was in the loss of many of her papers, her letters. And I found out, later I'll tell you real quickly what I did to find her information, was that when she died, people went into her home and just took papers and held on to them for 50 or 60 years and did nothing to them. So if you really want to obliterate somebody's history, just disperse their papers and don't do anything with them. And that was one of the things that happened to Drusilla Dungey Houston. I was very fortunate because I located family members, and again, this takes me into how I found Drusilla Dungey Houston. Went to, I called the library one day in just a fit of exasperation and said, does anybody here know anything about Drusilla Dungey Houston? And they said, oh, you mean my Aunt Rosie? I was on a plane the next morning to Arizona. And when I got there, a little old lady, about 89 or 90, in a huge Cadillac, met me at the airport and drove at about 80 miles an hour to her home, located in the Mesa, really away from Arizona. And there was her little house perched on a platform of concrete where the government, many, many years ago, had told people you could live here for free for just $1. And that's where she was. And it was there that the remains and the remnants of some of the beautiful writings of Drusilla Dungey Houston rested. Only I didn't know it. She made me work for it. And I had been there for 3 days and whining and dining her, so to say. And every time I would ask a question about Drusilla Dungey Houston, she'd say, I don't know why you like her so much. I never really liked her. And I thought, oh, this is going to be difficult. And so on the third day, she came over to my hotel room and brought a plastic box with 2 of Drusilla Dungey Houston's lost volumes, thousands of editorials, the scrapbook of Drusilla Dungey Houston's father, the scrapbook of her brother, photographs of Houston. I had never seen Houston before, trinkets that belonged to her, a photograph of Houston's grandmother and great-grandmother and her mother and her sisters. I was absolutely thrilled. So I went home with a bundle, and I actually had to keep still for a few days, before going through it. But one of the most exciting things in that material was something that is going to make a big stir not too long from now, was a lost screenplay that Drusilla had written. And it was a screenplay to refute Birth of a Nation. And it was written in her original hand, and it was also typed. And what makes it so important, and I mentioned that today, is because this year, 2015, is the 100th year of that film, Birth of a Nation. And what Houston did was unlike anything anybody else did, was as early as 1902, when the book The Klansman came out, on which the film is based, she began writing this screenplay, and she edited it all the way through the 1920s. And so she covered everything about this film, and although they said that Oscar Michaud, did a film, Birth of a Race, or that Booker T. Washington did another film, Up From Slavery, nothing compares to the work that Drusilla Dungey Houston did. And I can understand why she hit it. She hit it because this play did everything that Woodrow Wilson said in 1917. If you say anything negative about the war effort, this is World War I, he had enacted the Sedition Act, you will go to jail for at least 20 years. In some instances, you could even be hung. and Drusilla Houston, and it says you can't say anything negative about the president, nothing about the war effort, nothing outrageous, according to whites, blacks speaking about whites. And Drusilla Houston did all of that. And no wonder she hid this document. Until finally in 1933, she sent a copy of it, I believe, or at least mentioned it to Arthur A. Schomburg and said, I need you to help me to get this published. But she also sent another letter in 1933 to Du Bois saying, can you take a look at a play that I have written? It's just what we need now in the face of all of these riots and what have you. This will straighten things out. Black people will come to understand white people. White people will come to understand black people. We need this film now. And they ignored her. But in the scheme that Roscoe and Du Bois cooked up, they wanted to say that she had never written anything for African children. And that was one of the, I think, the deepest grievances against her, and that she was going downhill after that. The question is what can you do? There are thousands of women's stories, white and black, across this nation that have been buried for various reasons. Somebody didn't like them, somebody didn't understand them, historians forgot about them, people lost their papers. But you can change all of that. And I ask all of the students here in particular that you go to my website, Uncrowned Community Builders, and look at the 1,000 or more women whose stories we tell, the photographs with them. And what we did when we started this in 2001, and there hasn't been one like this, the webpage has never been down a day. And what this webpage does is offers you the opportunity to go write the story of your mother and of your grandmother. Save this for posterity. Write it. We will see it and help edit it if need be. But you can go, set yourself up with your own password, get onto that site, share the story, share videos, photographs, so people can see who you are and who is the family member that you're writing about. And this is an opportunity for young people for the first time in their careers, their academic careers, to be published online. It's a very valuable site. And last year alone, we had over 2.3 million inquiries and hits. It was people coming to the site, and the majority of them were from the universities and professors themselves seeking research on people that we don't know anything about. So I encourage you to go to the site, Uncrowned Community Builders. If you are writing papers, for example, on individual people, let me tell you that there's so much information out there, but there are some ways that you can organize yourself so that you're just not all scattered, because it takes too long to gather up all those bits. Lay out a plan for how you're going to investigate someone. And actually, you're right in the heart of regional history, because all history is regional. Take an area, take the Shenandoah Valley, for example. Who was in the Shenandoah Valley and did something with churches or schools or politics or animals or what have you? Build their bio, create a method that you can follow. I could never have done this work if I hadn't set up a framework, which is my matrix approach, that allowed me to organize the material so that I could gather it. The other thing is to ask others to join you in this kind of work. This has actually been a solo endeavor for me, but it's not to say that I haven't talked to almost everyone that I know about something about this woman, Drusilla Houston. And after the searching for many years, here's what I found, and here's what I did. On the one hand, when I found relatives, I went to their family reunions, and to go to a family reunion and see 400 people from the Dungey family, all tied together by DNA and genetics, it was really quite fascinating. Then to discover how many of them were poets and newspaper people, and then to discover how many of them were interested in understanding something about her, even though they didn't know about her. So that's one way that you can do it. The other thing is talk to people who are historians, because they may be strange people in some ways. But they have a lot of ways in which they can help you to see the broad horizon rather than just the speck on the horizon. And again, I have to thank my friend John Ray for helping me to do that. I don't want to forget Drusilla Houston and Thomas Dixon, although I mentioned it earlier, because this was critical. Here was an African-American woman that went to the core of what Dixon had done in all of his books, in all of his writings, and then finally his film. And I hope to be able to gather some more information about that and make a statement maybe at the end of the year or early part of the year about what this will look like. Joey and Gavin was very helpful in reading that for me, and we'll talk about it later. But I'd like to conclude now and have some questions from you, see if there's anything you'd like to ask me. Second.
Yeah. Let's thank her.
Did you get any indication of what inspired her to begin to look at ancient Africa in the late 1890s or the early 20th century?
Well, the second lecture tonight. No, Drusilla Houston's father was absolutely pivotal in her doing what she did. They were born here in the Shenandoah Valley. The father was born on a slave plantation called Crisscross. Anybody know that name? It was a short way of saying the cross of Christ. And this plantation where her father had been a slave for 27 years. And he escaped in 1859, went to Canada, returned in maybe 1864, went to Bates College and seminary and got, recognized as a minister, and traveled all over this country, building churches, buying books, building a library, and had one of the largest libraries of anybody for a very long time, over 3,000 books. And I'm sure that he inspired her. He, and I know what you're getting at, and that has to do with the whole Cushite thing. Her father was a member of the slave secret society called the Sons of Ham. And so she would have learned about the Cushites. And that was a society that the slave owners tried to break up, but they were unsuccessful in doing that.
Thank you for your presentation. I admire your devotion, as I do the devotion of any scholar. I wondered, in the marginalization that she felt from people like Du Bois and Washington, if it had any religious basis, because at that time, as we see in any fundamentalist religion, that there is this kind of discrimination against the thoughts of women. And do you think it came more from their ego as scholars of the time that they wanted to hold on to that area, or was it also tinged with religiosity?
Well, I think it was tinged with religiosity, but it was also tinged with the fact that these black women in Oklahoma and other places across the country were very powerful. And the majority of them also had newspapers. They knew that every self-respecting black person needed to have a mouthpiece, and the newspaper was it. Because you could stand back behind the newspaper. So I'm sure she was threatened, also because of not just religion as well, only, but the fact that she had the means of communications. And her newspaper was one of the largest in the Midwest, and along with the African American newspaper in Baltimore, Maryland, and the Cleveland newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio, and the Amsterdam News in New York City, and the Defender out of Chicago. Black women had a key role in that. And we know the Murphy family very well out of Baltimore, Maryland. And they're still in operation. So it was pivotal because, and people were reading what she said. There were people down south who were writing letters and saying, keep on writing your stories and whatever. But she was saying, I don't think black people and white people should be together. This is ridiculous. They're not the same kind of people. And so she was getting support from all over. But that had to be irksome for Du Bois. And also that she was digging in a research that they didn't want her to be digging in. And finally, in 1917, when the black the black leadership was convincing black men that yes, they should go to war to fight for the country in World War I, Du Bois and a couple of others from the Talented Tenth believed that if African Americans would show their loyalty to the country again and decide to go and fight abroad, that this would be the entree for them to be considered as equal in this country. It's like if we laid down our lives for you, if we laid in the same trenches with you at Verdun in Paris, France, and if we, and we gave you our lives, surely when we came back, you'll respect us as, equal human beings. Of course, they didn't do that. 1917, the big Houston riot, and where black soldiers were shot down. And those who defended themselves because they still had their rifles, they were executed. And Drusilla Houston was the person who went and got 25,000 signatures to send, asking for a reprieve from President Wilson, who was enormously involved in racism in the country and had segregated all of the federal facilities, and it was horrible. But Du Bois and a lot of other people in the Talented Ten believed seriously that if these black men laid their lives on the line, they could come back, and that they were gonna save the black man and the black woman. And nothing was further from the truth. And Drusilla Houston wrote again, and if it had been seen at that time, she would have been jailed. She says the black men are going to Germany to be breastplates for the white man. The U.S. Army segregated itself and said, black people, you can cook potatoes and you can wash toilets and you can do these things, so that's all you can do. And so and then we had the Tuskegee Airmen who set themselves up to really be extraordinary defenders of the country. But the riots that followed all across the South, the East St. Louis riot, I think in 1922, the Tulsa Race riot in 1921, the 1906 Augusta, Georgia riot, we don't even talk about that in the schools, in the colleges, in African history in the colleges, in the graduate schools in African history. There was this circle of activity going on, all designed to silence African Americans, to silence them in profound ways. Another question?
We have time for one more question.
Oh, come on, lay it on me. Okay.
Given your background in science, what set you on this path?
Who knows? I don't know. I'll say this real quickly. Sometimes you have to follow your passion. And the reality of it is, it doesn't necessarily come to you on day one. You can give it an old woman before it comes. But, deciding that you can do something, nobody tells me what to do. Nobody tells me what to think or how to organize myself. And it took me a long time to realize that I never belonged in any kind of setting with walls. I needed to be able to work someplace where I could decide how I wanted to do it. And I think it's in that framework that, at least for me, that I could develop a passion for this. And the more I read and could see that here was a person that reminded me a lot of me too. Working, and still not being recognized for something, or digging deeply for something, and looking up and say, oh my God, the world's gone past me. What, they're using computers now? And all those sort of things that help to grow your passion. But it does take passion to follow somebody. It's been many years that I followed this. But I veered off, I'll say this and then conclude, is that I've also written the story of the life of her father. Extraordinary man from the Shenandoah Valley. Just an extraordinary man. And so, but it's with a passion that I follow it, and I always will, I think.
Let's thank